Welcome. I'm Dr. Mujtaba Moharer, co-organizer of the Mobility Roundtable. I will be starting the roundtable and introducing the speakers. My guest co-organizer, Dr. Zahara Batool from the University of Leeds in the UK, will guide the Q&A, and we will close the session. Mobility and policy, how to overcome gridlock and create flow. In this roundtable, we will discuss how to create a more efficient process for policymaking that can keep pace with fast-moving technological advances. We'll discuss these questions and other questions over the next hour with our excellent speaker, Professor Rui Wang, Public Policy Analysis, UDB Professor at Xi'an, Jiaotong-Liverpool University in China. So I will hand over to you, Ray. Please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be invited, and I thank Dr. Mahara and Dr. Batool for organizing this event. In China right now it's midnight, but fortunately I'm currently with my family in Washington, in the suburb of Washington D.C. So it's a noontime talk, and just 1 minute about myself. I attended college in Beijing, and I got my PhD in public policy in Harvard Kennedy School. After that, I spent several years at UCLA in Los Angeles, teaching in the urban planning department, and then I moved to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in their environmental program. Before I returned back to China to spend time with my parents in Suzhou, Jiangsu province, close to Shanghai, about 100 kilometers away from Shanghai. By high-speed rail, that's about 23 minutes. The pandemic has changed a lot of things, delayed my family from returning back to China to join me. So I applied for leave, and now I'm in DC, suburban place, a place next to Arlington, Virginia. So okay, so this topic, so my research obviously has a lot, focused a lot on transport, particularly related to the environmental impacts and transport in urban areas. My other research concerned environmental sustainability and urban development, especially in China, to some extent in some other developing countries. So I'm expanding or broadening my spatial scope of research and connecting local and with global, domestic and with international issues, contrasting between China and the US and between China and Europe. That's my research. So transport, mobility, and policy. Mobility is a term that's supposed to be neutral. Although in some professionals and particularly the planning circles, accessibility would be considered a slightly more appropriate term when we talk about, which is correct. because we care more about the actual objectives. Mobility by itself is really a tool, but I believe it's a neutral term, as we, in particular, when we talk about how to technically deal with the consequences of mobility. As many of you probably are familiar with, policy responses to the negative consequences of mobility, such as environmental pollution, energy, resources, global climate change, safety issues, and associated sort of a secondary consequences like urban sprawl, segregation, etc. And it's even the implications on sort of local, regional, even national competitiveness. To deal with these, the classical sort of idea is really about looking at the demand first, and then of course also the supply, and then on top of that, we need to think of a longer term solution that is primarily land use, because land use doesn't change overnight, while supply and demand kind of can happen within an hour or even shorter time span, as people look at how traffic, how bad the traffic is outside of your window and decide when to get out. Right. So, but on top of that, which is one of the focuses of today's sort of discussion, is technology, right? Which is also a longer term consideration, given that technology advancement doesn't happen right away, and even after we have invented all the technologies we have, we need to invest them and we need to adopt them. That may create even longer delays in how we sort of change our behavior through technological advancement. So there are many sort of I guess people working in transport are very familiar with demand management, right? Roughly thinking, you would have command and control type of policies, right? By rationing people's use, from draconian orders of telling people not to use it, at certain time on certain dates, or just let's say the HOV lanes, allowing lanes to be used only by people, drivers, for example, carrying at least one or even two passengers to use it, right? So that's sort of rationing of road space. The big category is to price the use so that people can really feel the pain of the consequences they impose on others, on the society. You can price road space, you can price fuel, and you can price parking, right? And the last category, which is more of a soft way, is through education and the campaign. We do have evidence showing that over a longer term, we could influence people's behavior through changing their preference. The second category would be supply, because no matter how hard we change people's preference, we influence the perceived price or perceived cost of their travel behavior. If we don't have infrastructure, if we don't have fleet available, we're not gonna we're artificially sort of we're constraining people's choices, right? We need to meet the demand by creating the supply, and of course here the trick part is, you know, what kind of supply we create, right? Obviously, we want to supply what people need. Hopefully, you know, by after correcting their behavior with the right structure in terms of mode split, right? But on the other hand, in many cases, that means the supply needs to be able to adapt to the dynamic changes over time in the market demand. After that, you know, land use is often considered very important because that really defines, you know, partly the travel demand, right? There are many factors influencing travel demand, but if you don't, you know, if you put things so far apart, you're creating an artificially the need of traveling, right? There are many sort of principles that people may think would be helpful to facilitate a more sustainable mobility. I think over a longer term, from that perspective, you know, it's very difficult to change land use once it's been settled, once the cities or the region have been developed. So it actually, you know, would take a lot of foresight from the policy perspective if one could plan land use and transport ahead of time. That creates a lot of opportunities, make a lot of things easier. Another policy consideration of land use is the fragmentation of urban areas or regions. If you have a lot of governments you're creating, you know, and you don't have an institution available to coordinate them, that's going to be difficult. Technology, that's sort of all the previous discussions are based on a given sort of a set of technology that are relatively mature and affordable to us. However, you know, the fourth industrial revolution does create a lot of opportunities for us to sort of to make our system smarter, to exchange information between vehicles and infrastructure, and to change the fuel type, right? Particularly the e-bikes, e-cars, electric cars, etc., allowing people to share. You know, of course, in a lot of policy attention should be given to how we could sort of grow beneficial technologies and how the current system needs to get adjusted. One of my feelings is that we've been very excited about very advanced technology, such as autonomous cars, which is in fact very difficult to realize. But on the other hand, we probably haven't been paying enough attention on sort of the low tech advancements, such as, you know, how to make bicycles better, so that people can carry around in a much easier way. In fact, you know, a lot of evidence has shown that shared bikes have a long way to go. There are many drawbacks of shared systems and private vehicles. If we could, you know, create things that people can carry around with them easily, we probably can solve 80% of the problems. Right? But that hasn't been, you know, highlighted by a lot of practitioners and academics. So I'll stop here and probably let Dr. Batool to chip in, and welcome the questions and comments from the room.
Oh, thank you very much. Before Dr. Batool, because Zahara take the chair, I just want to be greedy and ask my own question, if it's okay. So actually, that was a very comprehensive and good introduction. The main question that comes to my mind is the applicability of policies that are working in the West, basically in the US and in Europe, to the rest of the world. How is it really applicable, or are there like fixed formulas for supply and demand, or whatever we use, or do we have to do we have really successful stories?
Well, that's a very important and also very broader question. I wrote a small article more than 10 years ago about this, looking at China and how sort of the Western policies could be applied in China. I would say you cannot, there are many factors for successful policy adoption. There are economic considerations, financial considerations, and political support, whether you have a coalition strong enough to support and sustain the policy. And you have an administrative capacity, right? Whether the government has the human resource, has the financial ability, has the administrative capacity to do it, right? In many countries, the fact is the government is neither authoritative enough or doesn't have the authority. I'm not saying you need an authoritarian government, but you do need a government authority, and also you need the government has sufficient capacity, right? So that creates a complicated sort of a case by case scenario that to a great extent in any city you would need to really consider all the options and consider what you could do and choose your the best thing you could do. And but on the other hand, there are a lot of things or principles that are applicable. For example, economists will always argue for a higher price. For negative consequences, externalities in particular, and the question is how you change the perceived private price, right? There are many ways. You could change the fuel, you could change the parking, you could change, you could you could ration the plates, right? License plates. There are many ways to change the price, and choosing which one is the real question. Right. Also, there are common pitfalls in most of the societies. For example, it's easy typically to build a coalition behind capital projects. But the problem is that capital projects typically cannot scale because of the high cost. Including the land assembly cost, right? For example, rail. It's very expensive, but favored by a lot of politicians because they, it's kind of shiny for their to build their political capital. And capital, if you cannot build a network in a short time, you are essentially build something so expensive cannot sustain itself. Once after you build it. Right, so that's basically a recipe for failure. Right? So I would say the basic principles apply, but each city or each region is different.
Thank you. Before Zahra, so please, I see already Carol Mir has written a comment. Please feel free, audience, to write your questions, or if you have a thought to share with us. Zahra, please.
Thank you very much. So we got our first question, and it's from Carol, and the question is very interesting. So it's being asked, so first of all, she says that you quickly touched on the top time lapse between the creation of policy to impact people's choices and the more immediate issue of choice that people respond to outside their front door. So the question now is that I imagine that the challenges of policymaking cohorts around attempts to coordinate multiple visions of urban areas and the needs of specific communities. Where do you lean in terms of ideas for reducing the slowness of policy and responding community needs or vision for itself? So it's basically about the implication of policy for basic community level, where people, where you can get people engagement. So any thoughts on that?
That's really tough, but extremely important question, because it's relatively easy to analyze policy alternatives, but when it's get to the implementation stage, invariably there are a lot of things one needs to consider. In many cases, the benefits are spread thin, enjoyed by a broader group of communities and people, while the costs sometimes are concentrated on people who, for example, need to move because of the space necessary for, such as, for building a system like a bus rapid transit, right? Or and people who are priced out because they chose to live outside of the city, where accordant pricing, congestion charging scheme is established, within for vehicles entering the central city, right? So one thing I mentioned earlier is a lot of questions are much easier if we have the foresight. For example, when extending the city to new suburban areas, or even when we expect a rapid growth of the urban areas, to plan land use and transport modes and infrastructure together would make things much easier to work. The government can also capture the value increase because of public investment in transport infrastructure. In existing communities, particularly relatively dense communities in urban regions, a lot of policies are very difficult to achieve, particularly related to ground transport, because land is scarce in dense urban areas, and especially when we are trying to assemble a linear space, right? You unavoidably needs to move people, and transport in many cases creates, public transit creates lots of positive benefits to cities and regions, but if you live too close to it, there are negative consequences, pollution, noise in particular, and the so-called undesirable visitors if a community is not very keen of protecting its own characters, right? So some of these concerns are legit. Some are probably reflecting, just the normal way of people trying to protect their own interests, especially short-term interests. That's why I think, if it's too difficult going this way, we really need to think of, making probably technology, even not very high-tech options. I'm a big fan of non-motorized options. For example, cycling. China has experienced about 5 to not 10, more than several years of massive experiments, not intentionally, but massive experiments of dockless shared bikes in a large number of cities. Market-wise, it's a failure, but but the idea was that if we could just make it so cheap somehow to get people to access these bikes, we are greatly reduce the pressure and creating these options for people that would benefit not just the environment but health. So there are options, but I would say personally, I would think the value of technology is not just so much in the very high-tech artificial intelligence, etc., autonomous vehicles. I see those as very remote options. But it's really in a lot of innovations we could try. In the end, the question would go into, what are the marketing incentives to push the society to explore all these options, and what are the ways to really constrain or restrict political leaders' sort of a preference for shiny, expensive projects. These are the challenges. But as Carol mentioned, if something is so complicated to implement, personally, I'm not very optimistic with, we could have messed up a lot of things, very important things like our healthcare system, right? So, not to mention urban transport. I just don't see it's easy. I see it as very challenging. We probably should spend more energy to explore alternatives.
So I think I'll take the leverage to ask another question, and that would be linked with this community engagement and societal readiness. So you talked about active travel, and cycling can be a good option. So for instance, in case of UK government and also people who are actively engaged in active travel research, they know that there are some known barriers to active travel. So for instance, people don't find it easy or find it difficult to get out of habit of using car, or there are not adequate infrastructure available, or also there is at some level there are low engagement from certain communities. So in case of UK, I can confirm that there is a physical activity level among BME community or people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. They are less engaged in active travel. So if I ask you that, do you have any examples that how behaviors of these people or the people who are struggling to make a change, how these behaviors can be changed, and what do you mean when you say correcting behavior? And is there any example or any case study where you have managed to bring change at any level, either individual or community level or at bigger level as well?
I think the world is still largely waiting for cheap solutions to reach your goal. We see great examples in generally in two types of areas. One is very rich, highly educated, wealthy societies where people in certain Nordic countries, for example, where even the climate isn't so appealing for biking, but still you could see that through infrastructure investment, through education campaigns, and through subsidies of the government, people are, people do have a lot of incentives to use non-motorized travel. The other group of examples sort of are those who intentionally sort of create a land use that very inducive to such travel behavior. The challenge is in societies where it's highly motorized, or it's motorizing and the transit service isn't very good. Sidewalk is bad. Bike lanes are near as dangerous as as you can imagine, right? And in these societies, it is very challenging. As you can probably see. So what to do? I think Rome isn't built in one day. You do need infrastructure for it. You need a right of way, and you need to make sure that cars and motor vehicles respect respect pedestrians and the cyclists. And you need to fundamentally, you need to sort of also make sure that alternatives are paying for the social costs that they created. I see that walking and cycling, except e-bike. Walking and cycling have natural limitations. You cannot travel long distances. E-bike is much better, but e-bike has its own issue. Even China hasn't solved it to a complete satisfaction. So for the trunk line travel, well, here so far we mainly talk about passenger transport. For the trunk line, you still need a good transit service. The key is how to make sure that it's as easy as possible, as safe as possible for people to walk there or bike there. That is something in many cases fairly rewarding in the long term, but probably not as rewarding to the politicians who propose, who's willing to take a lot of effort to do it. So it's quite challenging in this sense, but technically I see these as more feasible, except we do have other we have barriers, we have weakness in our system.
Thank you very much. And we got another question from Samin. She's asking, what would be the most effective policy to transform urban spaces for sustainable transport and active travel when governments trade their transport regulations? So, for example, they allow cars enter banned area instead of paying money.
I think that's sorry, but I think that's continuation.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so she's also saying, sorry. Yeah. So if we are seeking for car-free and pedestrian zones, should we take planning and construction solutions instead of soft solutions, for example, regulatory system? So
car-free and pedestrian zones are good ideas, but they have their costs. Because we know that you know, there's obvious cost of people's time, and in many cases that's very expensive. The richer the society, the denser the society, the higher the cost. So they are applicable in, you know, in a really kind of case by case situation, and otherwise, even one could implement it. Such kind of policies would eventually either result in a land use change or activity spatial location change of activities, or such policies won't be able to sustain. I mean, people do need to get to places where, you know, where they need to, right? You know, traffic congestion has created national emergencies in London in the 1990s. If you look at this history of London's congestion charge and other transport policies, you know, one of the key reasons was that you know, multinationals were thinking of relocating to other cities because London's traffic was so bad in late 1990s, right? Jakarta, Indonesia, the third largest, you know, a huge mega city, more than 20 million people, also called for a national emergency because those are really the engine of the economic system. And you cannot change the system overnight, saying, you know, we're going to have a radically different economy spatially, at least. But if that's not feasible, then, you know, the city needs to function. So you know, radical policies typically don't have you know, a lot of appealing. In most cases, you know, things like congestion charging in London was very difficult to start, right? You need a strong leadership. But, you know, even that isn't as radical as, say, you know, Carfree zone, because, you know, as long as you can pay, you can still get in, right? So, you know, New York City probably should have long started their congestion charging scheme, but you know, unfortunately, politically, it's just not easy because land use has been established for so many decades. Where, you know, these people, you know, a lot of people live in New Jersey, you know, Connecticut. They don't have great alternatives, right? And of course, nobody likes to be taxed, right?
Thanks very much.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
or
yes,
build up?
please.
Actually, Mina sort of addressed that. So Mina said hello all as a follow-up to with Dr. Wang's comment regarding the Nordic developed countries, and also aligned with the observation from Dr. Batool about infrastructure. Based on my experience, I can say that in Leeds, I didn't feel safe to cycle to work. However, now in Helsinki, in Finland, I favor active travel and I use the bike frequently. So this, thought that I am the same road user with the same expectations and the same profile and the same preference. I act very differently because of the infrastructure. And actually, this is what I wanted to build on. And I think it's a very important point that you raised. It's about building back to the question of Zahara about minorities and their travel pattern. And it costs. There needs to be a will from the institution to invest in that. As you said, Rome wasn't built in one overnight. So there needs to be a political will to invest in those, both infrastructure and other possibilities, having the schools, good schools around, so you don't have to drive your children to other cities or other part of the city or all those things. Is there, I mean, apart from I want to merge that with what you said earlier about the authority and authoritarian system, which I actually very interesting. Before the conversation, we were talking with Zahara about that having a very strong government, maybe a bit extreme, but makes these changes possible. Is there a balance there?
Let me say this. So first of all, you mentioned a couple of things at least. I think for a more efficient, sustainable, and inclusive transport system to work, the key challenge in every society is to create incentives and to hopefully also alter the preference of the choice riders, meaning the people who have choices, who could choose to drive, who could choose to to use the different ways, but they choose. If they choose to walk, if they choose to bike, then a lot of things would be much easier. Let's say the infrastructure would be easier to construct.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt here. But do you not need to have a safe infrastructure before allowing your child to get on the road?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Do you not?
Right. There's a chicken and egg problem here, and that's probably why we are stuck in most cases. That's also related to your second question, about authority. Authority could come from two sources. One is that the regime is very strong, so that there are consequences. People don't listen. And the other would be leadership, or an unusual high level of political capital, somehow possessed by an individual or a group of individuals. But both have the same problems. That is, if the leaders are not able or willing to work with the experts, and also work with the communities, or work with the people, and to find the solutions. They are always, in most cases, they make a lot of mistakes. By either way, in a strong leader in a democratic society, or a authoritarian government, they make more mistakes than in transport, right? Than not. So, and that creates the sort of vicious cycle, where if you don't have the sidewalks, for example, it's very difficult to kickstart it, to get people to walk with their kids, or have their kids walk or bike to school. I call those mistakes because if you compare the cost of building sidewalks versus the cost of, let's say, the Big Dig in Boston, a Big Dig could enable, I don't know how many hundreds of even 1,000 miles of sidewalks. I'm not saying that sidewalks are always easy to construct, because there are a lot of nitty-gritty issues you need to deal with so many stakeholders. right? But big data was not easy either, right? So but if you could construct a system, I'm not saying 100% continuous, but you could construct a system that's covering 75–80% of all the streets in a city, or let's say in a suburban community. You are making a lot of other policies much easier. But the problem is that who's willing to do that, right? We elect political leaders typically not based on their agenda of building sidewalks. There are other things we need to we prove or approve or disapprove, right? So that is sort of the dilemma that we face. Political leaders, most of them doesn't put priority on these things. So I would say still, it's a battle that's very tough. Cities are much, it's much easier if we have a planned community where from the start, we have somebody with the foresight to create situations that makes things a lot easier in the future. I do have, given the world is still urbanizing quickly, and given that now we are paying a lot of attention with global climate change, bad news are, full of the screen this year, last year, in the past 10 years, right? And I just hope that, something would at the level global and national levels, we could have a little bit of shift in the direction where we go. And that would certainly affect the transport because it creates roughly a quarter to a third of greenhouse gases.
Excellent. And I think we have a lot of interest and discussion about engaging communities. So Carol made a very interesting point here. And she said that much has been done in terms of educating population about active travel and the benefits to health and well-being. Yet in the United States, even with COVID-19, this has been education and incentive strategy is largely unsuccessful. What are some of the strategy innovation taking place in policy making to respond to the need for active travel to be first choice? And I will just add to her question is that the situation is quite same or similar in UK, at least I can confirm that. So all the efforts which have been done during COVID time, they are actually not paying off. So what's your take on that?
I agree. I completely agree. It's very, very difficult to change behavior if you don't change incentives structure. Fundamentally, we do need to think about the prices people face. Not necessarily, fuel price, but if you could, you could, be more efficient with parking pricing in densities, and you could be more, let's say, rational in pricing the use of roads. Because fundamentally, for example, in the US, a lot of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, are really near their useful life. There's actually some hope where we could use pricing for the daunting task of renewing our infrastructure instead of keep borrowing debt, right? So, but on the other hand, I think one could one cannot wait. In fact, if we do a lot of things together, right? A lot of demand management, a lot of land use changes, design changes of streets networks, we could, these little things together still create a significant sort of a impact on people's behavior, as strong as pricing and other policies. Except, as I said, these are fragmented, little efforts, needing a lot of attention and management skills, community working skills. So, it's not attractive to political leaders. It spends a lot of energy, but doesn't give them the return.
Yes. And that links to another question. Umar is asking, I have a question on how you mentioned about the drawbacks or flaws in the system. Are majority of current policies being influenced by an economist view, that is, pay more for higher impact? And moving forward, should they be considered based on a humanitarian benefit? Or is there a balance between these costs? How could that be achieved to provide sustainable long-term policies? That's a good question.
That's a fundamental challenge to us. Capitalism has, a lot of problems, despite its the benefits it creates for us. And this economic growth, the expansion of economic activities for more profit, for higher income, has showing more and more problems. Not everybody actually, most people are not really enjoying the benefits of higher growth rate. The issue is the majority of countries are not consciously seeking with effort alternative economy. They're not pursuing more of a sustainable prosperity, and for example, quality of life or happiness. Well, they're pursuing our speed of growth, the total economic activities by the accounting of GDP, and to some extent, I don't know, transport actually reflects all these issues in our system, our fossil fuel reliance, our need to boost vehicle sales, because our economy is based on it, our stock market is based on it, right? So it's I don't know, that's almost like as the whole civilization has a lot of limits, and to some extent, I'm not very optimistic of pursuing fundamental changes, because those are way beyond a single sector. But I still see, technologies like electric vehicles and connected 5G or connected vehicle and infrastructure, and sharing, and so-called low-tech innovations. I think those may give us surprises. Maybe I don't think we have to sort of radically change the system to sustain our transport. So there might be surprises.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very comprehensive discussion. So I'll hand it over to Mujtaba. Would you like to wrap up the session, please?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, please go ahead, because we started a couple minutes later, we can't do it. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Ray for if he has any final thoughts.
I talked a lot today. I probably should invite you guys to talk more. One reason is that this challenge is huge. It's so complicated, and unfortunately, besides building more stuff, the mobility or accessibility or transport challenges rarely get to the headline of our media. People care more about other sort of issues. As of now, of course, this pandemic, there's all these floods, drought, wildfire. There's all these political fights. But so I on the other hand, still, I would say there's always resources there to deal with transport problems. The challenge is that they are often not used at the right place. So I guess people working in this sector, I think I would encourage everybody, including myself, to think more of how to direct the resources to the right projects, the right things, right programs, and those are the true challenges regarding transport policy for sustainable mobility in the future.
Excellent, thank you. You made my job easy. I don't need to say anything for the wrap up. That was excellent wrap up. But I just too quick to point out, I believe, a few important points you made. One was the importance of and significance of having strong leadership, either through a political system or having a strong leader. How important that is to make change. The other point you made was it takes time to make fundamental changes, but they're not always necessary. You can use solutions that work with the existing system. And finally, is what was very interesting for me, the importance of incentive to make behavioral change, to make long-lasting change, and also the point you just made about direction of the resources and funding to the right place. Thank you very much, Ray. Thank you. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Very engaging, very insightful. Thanks for amazing audience. You had very great engagement. Thank you for your comments, and also Dr. Batool, Zahara, for her amazing co-host. As always, we will see you. We are always third Thursday of each month, the same time. So I will send when the recording of this event is edited and finished, usually in 2 weeks. I will also send the invitation for the next roundtable. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.